My daughter-in-law's family looked down on me my whole life. They never said it out loud, but I saw it in how they held their wine glasses when I walked into a room. On the night of their 25th anniversary gala, I stopped on Route 138 to pull a 7-year-old girl from a smoking, overturned SUV. I dialed 911, administered emergency first aid in the mud, and refused to leave until the paramedics and state troopers took over the scene. I arrived at the luxury resort 2 hours late, covered in mud and another person's blood. Instead of checking on me, they had security immediately escort me out of the lobby. They thought they had buried my dignity. They were wrong. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry when the broad-shouldered security guard ushered me through the heavy oak doors of Ocean Cliff Resort. I didn't beg my son Jacob to stand up to his father-in-law, nor did I look back at the Grand Imperial Ballroom, where 300 members of Rhode Island's high society sat in tailored tuxedos. The ocean air hitting my face on the Newport cliffs was freezing, but inside, my chest felt like solid stone. My hands, raw and scraped from frantically prying open the jammed door of a crumpled silver SUV on Route 138, were entirely steady. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I walked straight to my old dented sedan, completely ignoring the valet drivers who stared at my blood-stained clothes. I sat behind the wheel, pulled the invitation card from my purse, and looked at the $500 check I'd written for Stephanie Moncrief-Galloways' Vanity Pet Rescue charity. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long, always footing the bill for their artificial approval. Now, I realised it had been a subscription with me blindly paying for the privilege of being ignored. With slow, deliberate precision, I tore the check into 4 neat pieces and dropped them into the cup holder. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a balance sheet. I checked my phone. The screen remained dark, reflecting the mud drying on my old navy wool sweater. I knew Jacob wouldn't call. He had been swallowing his in-laws' particular brand of polite disdain for 9 years, losing his spine in exchange for a seat at tables where he was handled like a charity case. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, treating my blue-collar presence like an inconvenient liability. But that account was officially closed. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were only shocked that I had stopped playing along. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, a predictable machine that ran on facts and physics, completely unlike the volatile, status-driven environment I was leaving behind. I drove out of the resort parking lot and went straight to the local police precinct. I needed the truth locked down in black ink before Jeffrey and Stephanie could manipulate a narrative to protect their evening. I handed the desk sergeant the small leather purse the child's frantic mother had dropped in the grass, ensuring every specific detail of the accident on the highway was logged legally and undeniably. From the precinct, I drove to the hospital to check on the child. The sterile smell of the lobby felt honest compared to the ballroom. I confirmed that the little girl Zoe was stable and resting. I learned her mother was already in the trauma ward, so I left a note with the nursing staff letting them know her retrieved purse was safely logged at the police precinct. This wasn't revenge. It was a long overdue reality check. Inside my car, as the dashboard glowed in the quiet midnight air, I knew the balance of power had already started to shift. The hallway of my small home in Providence smelled like wet wool and silence when I finally walked through the door. I sat at the kitchen table beneath a dim yellow bulb, looking at the framed photograph of my late husband, Arthur. He had spent 40 years as a research engineer for the Public Transit Authority, a brilliant man who died with grease under his fingernails and zero recognition from the city he kept moving. I spent 35 years right beside him, managing the intricate scheduling grid for the state bus system. We knew how to keep gears turning. We understood the strict mathematics of structural foundations. But the Moncrief-Galloways didn't value structural foundations. They valued display. When our son Jacob married Madison, Jeffrey and Stephanie treated our family like a charitable obligation. They held their expensive wine glasses with a specific elevated tilt whenever I entered a room, a silent, calculated metric designed to remind me that a public transit employee didn't belong on their manicured Newport lawns. Yet, when Madison needed her graduate tuition paid, and Jeffrey flatly refused to fund it because he disdained her career choice and wanted to maintain absolute financial control over her, who cleared her savings account? I did. I stepped in as the silent investor, transferring $18,000 a year for 3 consecutive years, straight to ensure my son's wife didn't carry the crushing burden of debt. I did it quietly, without demanding my name be carved into a building or toasted at a gala. But the deep, bleeding fracture in our relationship went far beneath modern tuition bills. 10 years ago, Arthur had developed a preliminary prototype for a non-invasive brainwave mapping scanner meant to detect early onset neurological trauma in factory workers. He had consulted Jeffrey Moncrief-Galloway for medical validation, trusting his status as a leading specialist. Arthur died 2 years later, and within 18 months of his passing, Jeffrey's stolen neurodiagnostic array had already launched his private research institute into multi-million-dollar national prominence. They built their entire medical empire on the stolen, uncredited blueprints of my husband's intellect. They wore their stolen prestige like a shield, turning Arthur's life's work into country club memberships and diamond necklaces for Stephanie, while I was relegated to the children's table at family dinners, tolerated only when they needed a reliable matriarch to watch their estate. When we were first navigating this family merge, Arthur told me that a good machine doesn't make noise, it just does the work. And back then, I believed him, thinking quiet dignity would eventually earn respect. The cracked photo frame of Arthur sat exactly where their decade-long apology should have been, a constant reminder that my silence hadn't been peace. It had been an active endowment of their exploitation. But my patience had reached its absolute limit. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore, it was an unmapped fault line, and I was ready to let it fracture. The phone didn't stop vibrating against the kitchen counter. By midnight, the digital messages from my son and daughter-in-law began to mutate from confused inquiries into sharp, defensive lectures. The Moncrief-Galloways didn't apologise for having security escort a 68-year-old widow out into the coastal wind. Instead, they deployed their children to enforce their sterile narrative. Jacob texted first, his words hollowed out by 9 years of submission to his father-in-law's temper. He told me I was completely overreacting, that Jeffrey was a prominent physician who had to maintain strict clinical boundaries, and that I had created an unhygienic scene before prominent state officials. Seconds later, Madison chimed in, telling me how Stephanie was absolutely devastated because her milestone anniversary gala was ruined by gossip about why her mother-in-law was escorted away by guards. By 2 a.m, Stephanie herself had posted a photograph of the glittering ballroom on social media, writing that some people choose chaos and drama over family achievements, but she was blessed to be surrounded by true loyalty. I sat in the dark, watching the notifications illuminate the room with their coordinated cruelty. I didn't respond to a single one. I simply sat still, completely immune to their emotional blackmail, and analysed their pathology. This was the exact mechanism of the trap of cruel normalisation. When people spend decades in sterile, climate-controlled environments, insulated by wealth and high academic credentials, their empathy stops being a basic human instinct. It transforms into a performance metric. Jeffrey and Stephanie had built an existence where their self-worth was entirely dependent on superficial, curated perfection. In their minds, they were the arbiters of life and death. Highly respected neurosurgeons whose time was too valuable for the unpolished reality of a highway accident. They had normalized a terrifying level of structural cruelty, a mindset where a child seizing in the grass wasn't an urgent human emergency requiring a pause. It was merely an aesthetic threat to their $18 million evening. They genuinely believed that their professional status exempted them from common decency. To them, anyone who brought the messy, bleeding truth of the real world into their polished space wasn't a saviour. They were a dangerous disruption. This behaviour existed because their professional narcissism required total control over their environment. When I walked into that ballroom with mud on my sweater and gravel in my shoes, I didn't just break a dress code, I shattered the fragile, expensive illusion they had spent millions to construct. They had to turn me into a dramatic, unstable outsider to justify their own complete lack of remorse. Everything stayed silent as the clock ticked past 3. My resentment had completely burned away, leaving only a cold, calculating focus. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret for leaving the party, but there was only cold, beautiful clarity. I turned the phone on silent and set it face down on the table. They expected me to swallow their insults as I always had, completely blind to the fact that their leverage over me was gone. Inside, my kitchen was quiet, but my mind was clicking with the precision of a balance sheet. They had officially overdrafted my compliance, and I was done being the silent investor in their dynamic. I stopped tracking their emotional outbursts. Instead, I shifted my focus to the mechanical realities of their leverage. For 35 years in the Transit Authority, I had watched how a single misaligned switch could halt an entire grid. The Moncrief-Galloways believed their network of social capital made them untouchable, but every network has a terminal point, a structural vulnerability. My compassion had been a resource they overdrafted for a decade, but this wasn't a family grievance anymore. It was an audit. I called Evelyn. We had been friends since our children were in kindergarten, but more importantly, she was now a senior partner at a prominent corporate compliance and forensic accounting firm downtown. I walked into her office with a plastic storage bin containing Arthur's original hand-inked engineering ledgers from 2014, his preliminary patent communications with Jeffrey, and a certified copy of the police incident report from Highway 1, time-stamped at exactly 6:42 p.m. I set the heavy plastic bin on her pristine glass desk. I told Evelyn that they wanted to play a game of metrics, so it was time to show them how blue-collar data actually operates. Evelyn didn't ask emotional questions. She didn't offer hollow sympathy. She pulled out a fresh notepad, put on her reading glasses, and went to work, treating the Moncrief-Galloway empire exactly for what it was, a high-risk liability waiting to be exposed. Within 4 hours of data mapping, Evelyn's team had traced the underlying asset structure of the Moncrief-Galloway Neurological Institute. They uncovered the precise arterial line keeping their expansion afloat. The institute's non-profit status and upcoming research facility expansion were heavily reliant on an impending $18 million development grant from the Vance Family Foundation. It was a massive multi-year charitable healthcare trust managed entirely by Amanda Vance. Amanda was a multi-billionaire tech investor, and more importantly, she was the mother of little Zoe, the girl I had pulled from the smoking SUV while 27 elite cars swerved by. Jeffrey and Stephanie had spent months refining their clinical presentations to show an immaculate corporate face for Amanda's final signature, which was scheduled for Monday morning. They had automated their prestige, completely blind to the fact that their entire empire now sat on a fault line of their own making. Evelyn drafted a formal administrative notice of patent dispute and financial audit interest. We didn't file a loud, messy public lawsuit that their public relations team could easily spin as family drama. Instead, we submitted a cold, factual compliance disclosure directly to the internal audit board of the Vance Family Foundation. We attached the verified medical logs from Zoe's emergency stabilization and the official police report detailing how the institute's founders had used private security to suppress the very person who kept their lead donor's child alive. The professional shift effectively locked the gears of their transaction. It transformed a hidden family slight into an active, multi-million-dollar corporate liability assessment, forcing their coveted world of prestige to answer directly to the cold physics of accountability. The compliance mechanism didn't just lock the gears of their upcoming grant, it triggered a deep clinical excavation into the Institute's legal history. On Friday afternoon, Evelyn called me back to her office, her desk covered in high-resolution document scans. Her usual warmth was gone, replaced by the rigid precision of a prosecuting attorney. She turned her monitor toward me, pointing a silver pen at a digitized page from the Federal Patent Registry dated in 2017. "Leah, this isn't a civil dispute over uncredited ideas anymore," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh, steady whisper. When Jeffrey filed the secondary amendment to expand the diagnostic scanner's digital software array, the registry demanded a formal liability waiver. They needed an absolute waiver signed by Arthur, stating he had voluntarily forfeited all conceptual rights during their initial medical consultation. Look closely at the signature at the bottom of the registry vault page. I leaned forward, my chest tightening as I stared at the name Arthur McAllister emblazoned on the glass screen. The ink lines were perfectly fluid, clean and elegant. It looked immaculate. But my Arthur had developed a severe intention tremor in his right hand during the final 3 years of his life due to late-stage Parkinson's disease. In 2017, a simple task like holding a pen was an agonizing, trembling battle. His genuine signature from that painful era was a jagged, halting, shattered sequence of lines that took him nearly 30 seconds of intense concentration to execute. The signature on Jeffrey's waiver form was an absolute mathematical reproduction of Arthur's smooth, steady handwriting from 1995, pulled directly from an old Transit Authority consulting contract he had signed over 20 years prior. They forged it, Leah, Evelyn said, tapping the glass screen with cold finality. Our forensic handwriting team ran a structural overlay and pixel analysis. It is an identical copy. Jeffrey literally scanned an old document, mathematically isolated the baseline vectors, and printed it onto the waiver form to bypass your husband's late-stage tremors. They didn't just steal his mind while he was alive. They actively falsified a legal authorization while he was physically incapacitated, all to secure a multi-million-dollar global patent array. I looked at the forensic report, feeling a profound wave of clarity wash away the remaining residue of my grief. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was an investigation, and the cards were finally coming down. The final reckoning did not happen quietly in a courtroom. It exploded in the exact space where their arrogance had peaked. On Monday morning, Jeffrey and Stephanie Moncrief-Galloway stood in the polished private executive boardroom of their Neuro Institute, surrounded by their board of directors. They were waiting for Amanda Vance to sign the $18 million development grant. Press cameras were already positioned at the back of the room, ready to capture the immaculate illusion of their family legacy for the local business journals. Jacob and Madison stood a few paces behind them, dressed in tailored suits, smiling like perfectly trained background actors. The heavy double glass doors clicked open, but Amanda Vance didn't enter with her pen ready. She walked in wearing a tailored black suit, her expression as unyielding as granite. Her 7-year-old daughter, Zoe, walked right beside her, holding her left hand. And on Amanda's other side, walking with calm, measured precision in her old, unpolished shoes, was me. Stephanie's face did an extraordinary thing. In under 3 seconds, the arrogant smirk dissolved, and her skin went pale, then pink, then a shocking plaster white that her expensive foundation couldn't hide. Jeffrey froze mid-sentence, his hand hovering over the mahogany table. "Mrs. Vance," Jeffrey said, his voice instantly shedding its clinical superiority. He attempted to deploy his careful, slow doctor's pitch, the one he used to calm panicked patients. "I see you've brought Jacob's mother. Look, there has been a massive misunderstanding about our anniversary gala on Friday evening." "There is no misunderstanding," Dr. Moncrief-Galloway, Amanda Vance said, her voice cutting across the boardroom with the absolute authority of a woman who controlled half the industrial technology funds in New England. "My compliance team spent 48 hours reviewing the patent registry files for your institute's core diagnostic scanner. They found the handwriting forgery on Arthur McAllister's 2017 liability waiver. A formal criminal fraud disclosure has already been handed directly to the US Attorney's Office." Jeffrey gasped, clutching the edge of the glass table like a man on a capsizing boat. The board of directors exchanged frantic, terrified glances as the corporate cameras continued to roll, capturing their complete unmasking in real time. Furthermore, Amanda continued, looking at the pristine white walls of the facility. "My foundation only funds individuals whose core character we can trust. I reviewed the resort security footage from Friday night. I watched you use private security guards to expel the very woman who used her bare hands to save my daughter's life, while 27 other luxury vehicles swerved past on the highway. You chose the illusion of harmony over actual family connection. She picked up the unsigned $18 million contract from the table, tore it neatly down the middle before the rolling cameras, and dropped the shredded sheets directly into Jeffrey's trembling hands. The development funding is being redirected to St. Jude's Research Hospital immediately. Your name is being stripped from the pediatric wing proposal before sunset. I will not put my capital into a building run by criminals. Jeffrey sank into his executive chair, his eyes red and wet, completely defeated as his pristine world crumbled around him. He began to weep openly. He was a broken man, stripped of his stolen prestige. Madison buried her face in her hands, sobbing. My son Jacob stepped out from behind the table. He looked at his father-in-law's weeping form, then looked at my raw, scratched hands and the psychological chains of 9 years completely shattered. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer a defense. We're leaving, Madison, Jacob said, his voice entirely steady for the first time in his adult life. We are walking out with my mother right now. Madison looked at her ruined parents, grabbed Jacob's hand, and walked out right behind us. Inside, the boardroom was an absolute wreck of facts and consequences. We walked out together, and the cameras captured every single second of our departure. The collapse of the Moncrief-Galloway empire was swift and absolute. Facing a criminal investigation for patent forgery, their entire network of social capital dissolved within 6 months. Jeffrey and Stephanie liquidated their luxury Newport estate to cover mounting legal fees, ultimately relocating to a cramped, rundown apartment on the outskirts of Cranston. Stripped entirely of the social prestige they had weaponized against others, they had nothing left. Jacob and Madison moved to a quiet neighborhood in Vermont, completely removed from the toxic pull of her parents' lifestyle. We had dinner last Sunday at my small kitchen table in Providence. The room smelled like fresh coffee and old books, and the evening light caught a new, framed drawing hanging next to the window. It was a picture drawn by 7-year-old Zoe, a sketch of a silver-haired woman holding a little girl's hand in a field of green crayon grass. At the top, in large, careful letters, it read, "Thank you, miss. Leah, you are my real hero." Watching that drawing catch the sunset, I couldn't help but reflect on the illusion my sons-in-laws had lived in. This was the true trap of a hollow soul. Jeffrey and Stephanie had spent their entire lives confusing what they possessed with who they actually were. They believed that having status and capital meant they possessed an elevated human value. But wealth is merely a temporary coat of paint. Their prestige was a layer of status rented through capital, and the moment that capital was stripped away, they had no inner architecture of character left to stand on. They were completely hollow inside their ruined lives. I've come to realise that we spend far too much of our finite time on this earth chasing approval from rooms we don't actually want to live in. I spent decades worrying that my blue-collar transit coordinator background made me less than constantly anxious about whether my clothes were nice enough for a wealthy dinner table. But true human validation never requires an invitation. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from their toxic expectations. Don't bend your spine trying to fit into spaces designed to keep you small, and never apologize for the honest work your hands have done. Keep doing the small, decent thing when nobody is grading you, because what you build quietly in private is exactly what will stand beside you when the cards finally come down. If this journey brought clarity to your own life, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with one person who needs to remember their own worth today. Take care of each other out there.